So the aims for this session this afternoon, as you can see from the slide, it's all focused around the performance management process, particularly obviously the statutory requirement for the performance management process for teachers, but a lot of what I'll cover as well this afternoon is applicable to all staff within schools on your service as well. So there should be some performance management for everybody, but the aims for today's session is about hopefully at the end of the session you'll understand the requirements in relation to the performance management process and its purpose. We're going to review the role of the performance management process in raising standards within schools or your service. We'll be reviewing how performance management is embedded into that broad context of school improvement processes. Establishing that relationship between the professional standards and the performance management. So there's professional standards now for both teachers and for assisting teaching as well, so teaching assistants, and that we'll have a little look about how they sort of are incorporated into that performance management process, and also then going through how it operationally the performance management process works. So an outline of what the roles and the responsibilities are of those involved and what to expect in terms of that cycle as well as you go through that cycle. There's going to, like I said earlier, there will be a couple of opportunities throughout the session for you to have a discussion as a group, but also, you know, please ask questions as we go along. If there's anything you want me to sort of go over in a little bit more detail or something I say which raises a question, then please just either use that hands up function or pop a question in the chat, and then I can answer them as we go along as well. So just to give you a basic overview to begin with, under the school teacher appraisals regulations, so the specific ones for Wales, it is a statutory requirement to undertake performance management with all teachers who are employed within a school or within a central service. So that includes from the head teacher, you know, anyone on the senior leadership team, and all sort of classroom teachers as well. You might be aware as well that there's been some recent changes to the school teachers pay and conditions document from last year, whereas previously there was a link between performance management and pay progression. That link has now been removed, so there is no longer a direct link that requires appraisers to provide any kind of recommendation on pay progression based on the outcome of the performance management process. So that's with effect from September last year, but that removal of that link does not remove that statutory requirement to undertake the performance management process. So I just want to clarify so that there's no confusion. There is still that expectation and that statutory requirement that performance management takes place. It's just no longer directly linked to pay progression. So under the statutory requirement, like I said, it applies to all teachers who are employed at a school or within that central service, but there are just a few exceptions to the rule. So any teachers you have employed on contracts of less than 1 term, so any supply teachers or anyone on a very short fixed term contract, there's no requirement to undertake performance management with those individuals. Also, any teachers you have, so newly qualified teachers who are undergoing that NQT induction process. Effectively, the NQT induction process is a performance management process in itself. It's just specific to newly qualified teachers, and their performance is being assessed throughout that time anyway. So that would be in place of the performance management process. So you wouldn't be undertaking performance management in addition to induction. And then finally as well, it doesn't apply to any teachers where there's any sort of serious concerns about their performance and they are subject to the school's capability policy. So in circumstances where you do have a teacher who is being taken through a capability process, that formal capability procedure will supersede the performance management process. So you would suspend your performance management process at the time that starts, and it would only recommence at the point that that capability procedure has been concluded. With regards to support staff, they aren't under the statutory requirements with those School Teacher Appraisal Wales regulations. However, it is strongly recommended and it's considered best practice that all staff within schools and all staff within the service area would have a performance management process. So I would suggest that everything we cover today would be equally applicable to your support staff as well within schools. So just to go through the role of the performance management in the school improvement process. So it is about setting that framework for teachers and leaders to agree and review priorities and objectives in the context of the school improvement plan. And I'll talk a lot this afternoon about that golden thread, so that there needs to be that direct link between what people are working towards in their performance management and how that achieves the overall objectives of your school development, school improvement plans, in order to make sure that everybody is effectively working towards the same goal, but in the context of their role. So by having performance management in the school, it supports the development of your practitioners as individuals, but also as in teams, because you may have a group of staff who are all working towards a similar objective in trying to achieve those ultimate aims in the school improvement plan. And it also helps teachers, head teachers, all school staff to meet the needs of children and to raise standards and support pupil well-being as well. And those standards of performance need to reflect the skills, the knowledge, the experience and those behaviours that you require from staff to perform their duties efficiently and to a satisfactory level. So all of those elements should help contribute towards that. In addition to that, undertaking robust performance management processes does demonstrate the school's commitment as well to professional learning, so developing your practitioners within school effectively. Professional learning is a key part of performance management. The idea is you want people to continuously improve, and they can only do that really through the professional learning and development. So by having a robust performance management process where that is discussed, that enables you then to be able to develop those practitioners effectively. It helps also ensure job satisfaction. By having those discussions as part of performance management, there's more likelihood that staff will have a really clear understanding of where their role sits within the school, how they contribute effectively to that overall school development plan, and just they will get recognised for their achievements, they'll know what they're working towards, and all of that helps with ensuring that job satisfaction because it gives a level of certainty to individuals and it also makes them feel invested in as well. It also helps ensure high levels of expertise across the school or the service because you're encouraging maybe the sharing of good practice, you're making sure you're investing in that professional learning and the development in people, and that's only going to increase that expertise. And the more expertise you've got, the more you can share that across the wider group of staff. And it supports that progression of practitioners in their chosen profession. So as part of those discussions, you'll be talking about what people's aspirations are, maybe talking to them about maybe how you can support them to achieve those aspirations as well. And again, that all links in again then to that job satisfaction. And what's really important with performance management is actually it starts at that recruitment stage. So the induction of the newly appointed staff is that important starting point for performance management, and that's separate to newly qualified teacher induction. This is about your induction that you provide to new staff coming into your school or your service. So as part of that induction process, you should be covering off what to expect as far as performance management is concerned within the school. So you should cover that off with new staff when they start to ensure that they then understand the requirements of their role, what they can expect from the performance management process. And again, it's about talking to them about those skills, the knowledge, the competencies, which whilst you'll have tested some of that as part of the interview process, nobody is the finished product. So there's always going to be elements where there's going to be areas for development. So you can have those conversations early on about how to sort of support staff in settling into those roles. And by having that clear and consistent appraisal of performance, that will then help drive up accountability and standards because you're focusing on those objectives, you're focusing on the professional standards and your priorities, and you're providing a clear description as well of the evidence that you'd be looking at to underpin those review process. And by having that real clear focus and clear process in place for performance management within the school, you're having that standardized process as well. So it reduces variability and everyone's getting an equal opportunity to have those discussions as part of their role. OK, so one thing that this is designed to show is that performance management is not a standalone process. So I mentioned earlier that golden thread, and it is absolutely integral to school improvement. So performance management, it's linked into looking at what your whole school priorities are, your regional and your national priorities as well. So you'll be linking in that is linked into your school development plan and any sort of evaluation that you might be doing. And you know, that really is key to making sure that you've got that link between an individual's performance management and how that overall contributes to your school development plan and the achievement of the aims and the objectives within that. So it's really important that if you involve staff with your school development plan or a service development plan, then they can see the link and they will have a better understanding of how they fit into the jigsaw. So you'll have your overarching aims and objectives, and it's useful to have a discussion of, okay, so in your role, this is an objective that you've got, and actually this is how that then translates into the achievement of objectives within our school development plan, so they can really see and contribute to that element and can see where they sit in that bigger picture as well. Clearly, you know, ultimately you're there for supporting learners' well-being and their progress, so that needs to be taken into account as part of the performance management process, and also it links in with those professional standards, which I will cover in more detail later, but that, like I said earlier, there is the professional standards for leadership and teaching. There's also the professional standards for assisting teaching as well, and performance management links in with all of those as well, so I'll cover those a little bit later on in the session. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the process itself, under the School Teacher Appraisals Wales regulations, the requirement is for teachers that the performance management cycle runs for 12 months. And it's the responsibility of the governing body to set the cycle, but in practice, what I would say, you know, that's usually done with the advice from the head teacher, because the head will advise the governing body of what really works best as far as the cycle within your school. So in setting that cycle, the head teacher and the governing body might want to ensure that the timings of that link with the school's planning cycle, so that you understand what your school development plan is before you start looking at how the individuals are going to contribute to that. And if you've got any sort of evaluation cycles that you're working to that might enable the availability of performance data, for example, to be available, then again you might want to take into account that you're making sure that that is possible when you're setting that 12-month cycle as well. So the performance management process in schools should be designed to ensure accountability for employee performance through that monitoring, evaluating and development, in order to enable employees to operate effectively and efficiently, and so that they can then also achieve better outcomes for learners. And that annual performance review is your opportunity for the appraisee and the appraiser, in the case of a head teacher, that would be an appraisal panel, to more formally recognise achievements and to discuss areas for improvement, support and the professional development. So you have this cycle that you can see on the screen. So you've got your planning, your monitoring and your reviewing, and as part of the process, the more formal process, there is of course that 12-month review. And normally you would also have a sort of 6-month sort of monitoring discussion as well. However, what's really important is that feedback isn't confined to discussion twice a year in that 6-monthly review and the annual review. So for performance management to be truly effective, feedback needs to be provided on a regular basis, not necessarily in a formal way. It can be informal conversations, it can be maybe group discussions in team meetings, just general notice and encouraging good performance and providing that informal recognition to somebody when they've done a good job. But it's really important that there is that ongoing for it to be most effective. It should be a supportive and a developmental process, and to enable that, it needs to be embedded in that everyday practice. So it's about that partnership between the appraiser and the appraisee. And I mentioned earlier, obviously you want to make sure that the appraisee is part of there and they feel that they own their performance management process, because generally you will then get the most out of it. And if you think of, I think a good metaphor for demonstrating why there's that need for that continuous feedback is if you think of a sports scenario. So sport is a really fantastic metaphor for it, because you can't ever imagine an Olympic athlete, for example, waiting 6 months or a year for feedback on how they've got on during various training days or their performance at an event. They will always get live feedback and live reinforcement of the good things that are going on. And it's a really a very agile learning environment in that respect. And I'm not suggesting it needs to be quite as intense as that as a professional sports environment. But what that point is to demonstrate really is the principle and the benefit of regular feedback to enable support and development. If you follow the minimum requirements for the performance management process and you don't have much in between discussions, then what that can lead to is peaks and troughs in terms of people's performance, whereas having regular one-to-ones as opposed to that twice yearly appraisal helps drive that performance more effectively. So in reality, you probably meet with these individuals on a regular basis. So it's about making sure as appraisers you consider how you can utilise that time to support performance and just have a check-in to see how people are getting on. And that just keeps objectives at the forefront, it keeps that recognition, and it just keeps engagement in the process as well. And it will make that annual performance discussion at the end of the 12 months much more effective, because you'll have been on top of it throughout the whole year then. And that, what's really important is that those individuals have actually got the right to receive that positive and constructive feedback and be provided with that clear direction to help focus and prioritise their workload, and that regular discussion enables you to do that. Appraisal and feedback discussions also need to focus on the professional learning needs of the employee. So you've got, your formal annual performance review, but as part of the planning cycle as well, you'll be talking to them about what professional learning they may need in order to help them achieve the objectives or progress in their chosen sort of career progression. So it is a key element of the performance management process, and you might discuss a number of different professional learning activities. So you could have team teaching. It might be that somebody's going to go and shadow a colleague. It can be that somebody's going to go off and do some personal reading or research to help towards the achievement of an objective or towards implementing something new within school. They may go on a focused learning visit to observe good practice elsewhere. That can be within the school, that can be outside of the school. You might have them attending professional learning courses or having something delivered as part of inset days. So there's a whole host of opportunities to think about when you're talking about somebody's professional learning, but that is a really key important part of that performance management process, and that's just about supporting that member of staff to enhance their skills and their knowledge, develop their strengths and address any areas for personal development, which can then also help them achieve any agreed objectives that you've put in place at the start of the cycle as well. Okay, any questions so far? So we've covered off, you've obviously looked at the best practice as part of your group discussion, and best practice in performance management is characterised, as I said earlier, about that collaborative approach. So it's about where the appraiser and the individual take joint responsibility for the effective implementation of the process. Ideally, you want that individual to be owning their performance management process. They should be driving it. They should be thinking about their own objectives. They should be thinking about how they can demonstrate to you that those objectives have been achieved, so that they're collecting that evidence themselves as well and feeding back to you on how they're getting on. So having that as part of the discussions and encouraging them to be giving you feedback as well as you giving them feedback is a really important part of the process, and just gives them that level of engagement then with the process itself. Also, there's that commitment as well to learner achievement and well-being, and obviously well-being I think is a key focus at the moment. It always has been important, but more so now than ever. That well-being, that sort of recovery phase from the last couple of years that schools have and the services have been working with, that there's going to be a huge focus on well-being now as well as part of those processes. It's about having an appreciation of the crucial role that teachers and support staff play as well. So it's really understanding their role and demonstrating to them how they contribute to the overall successes within the school as well. that commitment to professional learning and the performance and well-being of staff as well. So it's not just about the well-being of the pupils. If you're looking after staff well-being, they're in a better position then to also be looking after the pupil well-being as well. And what's really important is that atmosphere of trust between the individual and their appraiser. So by having that atmosphere of trust between them, that allows for a rigorous evaluation of strengths, but also that honest discussion around areas for development. People are more likely to admit that they might need a little bit of development in a particular area if they trust in the person that they are actually having that discussion with as well. Encouragement to share good practice, utilise that within your school or your service. If you've got people who are performing really, really well, don't just let them perform in their little silo. Make sure that they're sharing their practice so that that gets spread wider across the school. And that integration of the performance management into the overall approach to leading and managing the school. And that's really important. It's about demonstrating that this isn't a standalone process. Actually, this feeds into everything across the school. And one example that I have seen that works in practice, and a couple of years ago now, that since I went and spoke to the head here, is a performance management system in a school that incorporates all of these best practices in Jubilee Park. So I met with a head teacher it was pre-COVID, so it was quite some time ago now, to get an understanding of how they approached it, because I'd heard a little bit about their approach, and that head teacher did recognise that she was in a very fortunate position because she took over when it was a brand new school, so she was able to shape the culture. But that doesn't mean that others can't achieve it in established schools. It might just take a little bit longer to change people's mindsets sometimes. But what the school has done is they've adopted the regional performance management policy that's been agreed by the 5 local authorities, but they've established a culture with staff where it focuses on development. So they don't actually in practice call it performance management. They rebranded it as performance development, and they call their appraisers mentors instead. So I think the terminology performance management is often viewed quite negatively, and that could just be related to that language about it maybe feeling a little bit more of a done-to approach, as does the word appraiser. Somebody's coming in to appraise that, whereas the use of that word mentor demonstrates a more collaborative and supportive approach, and calling that process performance development demonstrates that it's centred on supporting and developing the person, so it's not viewed as a punitive process as such. The regional policy and what's commended to you by local authorities is written in a way that reflects the terminology of the Welsh Government guidance and the appraisal regulations. So clearly anything that we're putting out does need to sort of reflect that. However, that doesn't mean that schools can't use different terminology in the way it's actually implemented in practice, and that's what's worked in Jubilee Park. But just some key things for you, just to give you an example of the approach that they use in school. Is their professional development runs through everything they do in the school, so they can see clear links to their mission and their vision. So at the time that I spoke to them, I believe this is still the case. Their mission is inspire, nurture and celebrate success. And those statements are central to a good performance management process. So, they're very clear that those statements apply to everybody in the school, so not just the learners. So they're all the elements that the focus should be on rather than the outcome. So if the inspiration, the nurture and the celebration of success are in place, then the outcome should be that staff are performing better. What they also have is 3 vision principles, so which are the foundation for their strategic purpose and aspirations. So their 3 vision principles are that they're committed to igniting a passion for learning, creating the conditions to thrive and growing together with the community. And again, they're very clear with staff that this doesn't just apply to learners, it applies to staff as well. And again, that's key to supporting professional learning as well. So they make a lot of discussion around the link between performance management processes and the national mission. There's particular emphasis put on the head teacher's responsibility to drive that development of a high quality education, and that again underpins their performance management processes. And I think the quote that you can see on the slide is really relevant to that their approach. So it's about creating that culture where it says every teacher, but I would say every staff member believes they need to improve, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better, and there's no limit to what they can achieve. And if you're working to that basis, then people will always want to be improving and doing the best job that they can. And what they do encourage is that the staff take responsibility for their own professional learning, and they provide them with the time to do this. So rather than having staff meetings where they're providing information to people, they have weekly professional learning sessions which always focus and relate back to their vision, and then they get staff at the end of each term to complete an experience form and celebrate their success and provide information to groups about what they did, what they've learned, what was the impact, and what are they going to do next. So they're having those discussions and continuously talking about how they're putting their professional learning into practice. So I mentioned the professional standards a few times already in the session, and I'm sure you're all aware that the professional standards for teaching and leadership have been in place now, I believe, since 2018, I think. And back in September 2019, they also introduced the professional standards for assisting teaching as well. So that's targeted at the teaching assistants within schools and education services. So each of the 5 standards that are identified, so both professional standards have got these 5 areas of pedagogy, collaboration, leadership, professional learning and innovation. And each of those 5 standards are supported by a range of descriptors for practitioners to explore in a developmental way. And the purpose of those professional standards is about setting clear expectations about what effective practice looks like for a practitioner, but also enabling practitioners to reflect on their practice individually and collectively against what these nationally agreed standards of effective practice are. And also looking at what highly effective would look like so that they can identify areas for further professional development. So the standards themselves show what sustained highly effective practice looks like as well. So that helps provide a focus for career-long professional learning for an individual. And it's an important aspect of supporting all those practitioners to actively engage in professional learning with the purpose of developing individual and collective expertise. So, like I said, those 5 standards are there. Certainly for teachers, there is an expectation, and I think as well for within the assistant teaching, that practitioners are aligning with the standards, that they do sort of demonstrate that they are working in line with it. The highly effective practice, for example, you can use that. If I give the example of teaching assistants, for example, if you've got a teaching assistant who's seeking higher level teaching assistant status, then the likelihood is you're going to be talking to them about how they meet some of those highly effective practice and the descriptors around those areas before they undertake the HLTA scheme and they get awarded that HLTA status. So it's pitching it at the right sort of professional learning to enable somebody to raise their practice so that they can achieve what they want to in their career, as well as that minimum part of effective practice as well. And they're an important aspect of supporting individuals. And what I would suggest you do is you consider how you use the professional standards to support and embed professional learning within your current professional development systems and processes. And that performance management is obviously part of that. But what's really important to remember is that these professional standards form a backdrop to the performance management process. So they're not to be used as a checklist. You know, when you have your appraisal discussions, you're not to have them there and tick off that everybody is meeting those minimum standards of the effective practice. However, when you are discussing objectives, you might want to have a discussion with somebody about, okay, we're going to set this objective. How does that relate to the professional standards, so that they can see the link to them? And you might pick out 1 or 2 key areas of the professional standards that would link in quite clearly with the objective that somebody's working to. So it's part of the discussion, but it's not a checklist. I'm just going to move on now to the different roles and responsibilities as part of the performance management process. So What you want is all employees to play a vital role in achieving the requirements of the performance management process. But in order to help them, appraisers need to be creating the circumstances in which those individuals can perform to the standard required by their job description, and also by the standards required by those professional standards that we just spoke about. You want appraisers to be making sure that all individuals that they line manage, that they are responsible for with their performance management, know and understand what their current level of performance is and the ways in which their performance can be improved, and maybe by when you're talking about, for those improvements or that development to be seen. There's a requirement on the appraiser as well to this is all in addition to what you can see on the screen, make sure they're providing the necessary support to assist employees. So that's about the discussion around the professional learning, making sure you're discussing professional development needs so that that individual is supported in order to be able to achieve the objectives. So at the start of it, obviously, first and foremost, you need to set objectives with the individual. So you need to be having a discussion around what objectives that individual is going to be working towards, how you're going to monitor, review those, what are those measurable outcomes that you might be looking for, discussion around the feedback, so making sure as an appraiser that you are providing regular feedback throughout the cycle, and also having those discussions around the professional development needs of the individual. So if there are particular objectives in place, how are we going to do that? And is there any additional professional learning that you might need in order to be able to ensure that you are meeting those needs as well? What's really important as well as an appraiser is that you're keeping those accurate records of the agreed objectives and the evidence of progress. So I mentioned earlier that there is a regionally agreed performance management policy, and within that performance management policy that has been recommended to all schools across the region, there are some templates for you to be able to use. So you should have a statement of objectives in there. You should have your appraisal review statement as well. So following on from the review at the end of the 12 months, you would complete that. There should also be a statement in there which enables you to note down any sort of professional learning or training, agreed training that will take place over that 12-month period as well. So there are set documents within the performance management policy which will enable you to keep those accurate records of the agreed objectives, evidence of progress, and anything else that is being put in place. With regards to UPS progression, I think this is the one that is really important. So whilst they have removed any pay progression recommendations linked to performance management, progression from main pay scale onto upper pay scale is actually still part of the sort of recommendations. So it is reliant on 2 successful performance management processes. So there is a requirement on the appraiser when you're having a discussion about setting those objectives to consider and discuss with the individual, if they are a teacher, are you likely to be applying to go through the upper pay spine threshold in the next couple of years? And if so, we need to sort of think about making sure that those objectives are going to help you reflect that you're meeting the UPS standards. So that's the only element where you will, as an appraiser, maybe need to make some recommendations at the end of the 2 years of whether and making sure that they can demonstrate that they are actually meeting the standards via the achievement of their objectives in those 2 years. Part of obviously being an appraiser, and some of you touched on it on the Jamboard earlier, is about making sure that you've got the knowledge and understanding you need to do the job effectively. So just quickly, I'd just like to use the chat function. As an appraiser, I'd like you to just note down what sort of knowledge do you think is needed, and what would you need a good understanding of in order to be able to do the job to the best of your ability, really. So what kind of things do you need a secure understanding of in order to be able to undertake the role effectively? If you could just enter your thoughts in the chat, please. Professional learning opportunities available. Yeah, absolutely, Esther. The PL is really important as part of it, so making sure that you know where they can access that would be good. The roles and responsibilities, what good looks like. Yes, definitely, Nick. Yeah, understanding how to provide effective feedback, and that's really important, Emma. If you don't do that feedback effectively, then it can really demotivate people. So I think giving that effective feedback is really important. Examples of good performance. Yeah, certainly. If you need to know what good performance looks like. Coaching and mentoring and the difference between them. Yeah, and when to coach and when to mentor, because there's a role in both of those, isn't there? It's important that you need to act as a mentor, but coaching so that somebody has that ownership is really important. Where to signpost for support. Yeah, absolutely. And coaching and training. Having challenging conversations. Yeah, what I haven't picked up on yet is actually what happens when you've got somebody who's not performing, or where something isn't going as well as you would expect it to. So certainly, having that confidence to be able to have that what feels slightly more challenging conversation and explore why certain performance measures maybe aren't being met is really important. What motivates people you are developing? Yeah, what are their barriers? So it's an understanding of the person that you're line managing as well, isn't it? Strengths and areas of development. Well, yeah. How to deal with opposite opinions following observations. This is great. There's loads of ideas coming through here. And the organisation's goals. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. That's they're coming through thick and fast there with all of your ideas. So there's lots and lots of stuff that you would expect an appraiser knows how to do. But yeah, celebrating success, I think that's really important for that motivation and obviously, to encourage people to keep on learning. So thank you, all of you, for that input. It was really really useful there. Okay, so just to give you a little bit more, probably these are more specific rather than the more sort of, these are specific pieces of information rather than the softer people skills, I think, that actually are absolutely vital and don't feature on here, but featured quite a lot in the chat. And with that, you can have an understanding of a lot of these, but actually without those people skills that you've picked up on in the chat, the execution and the delivery of it is not going to be the same. But as a minimum, you certainly need people who are in appraisal roles to understand the context, obviously, of the school, to understand how to interpret data and the relevance to the objectives. They need to have a clear understanding of your school development plan and the improvement priorities, the individual's job that they're line managing. They need to know how to access and understand the relevant professional standards. First and foremost, what is the the performance management process in the school, because they need to know what's expected of them as part of that. And I think, probably picking up a lot on that coaching and mentoring sort of element that was mentioned in the chat, how to ask the right questions to engage that employee in the process as well. So, encouraging that engagement. And I think a lot of what was covered off there in the chat really does fall within that part of it. It's about getting that individual engaged, and once you've got that, it does make that job a little bit easier. And the attributes of the appraiser probably fall a little bit more towards those discussions where you need somebody who's got good communication and personal skills, because that will help build up that trust with the individuals. Ideally, you want them to have a good working relationship with the individual that they're line managing based on that trust and respect. And that encourages that two-way process where the individual is confident to contribute to the setting of their objectives, to be confident in discussing any areas they might feel that they need to develop in, and to be confident to approach their appraiser to discuss any matters that maybe aren't going quite as well throughout the process, or actually to be feeling confident that they can just go up and say, do you know what, this went really well and I want to share that with you. So it's that really good working relationship that will enable that really open discussion then as well. You need somebody who's got some good skills as well in information seeking and analysing data if you're using it as well, and the ability to understand, interpret, and maybe look at those key performance indicators relating to school performance. Now, appreciate that, that the data side of things probably is at a lower level at the moment because of the fact that you're not required to be reporting on any data outside of your school. But it's knowing how you're progressing within the school that's important, and how to interpret that information. And you've all picked up earlier as well with the Jamboard, that sufficient time. So it's really important that they've got sufficient time to carry out their role as an appraiser and do justice to the process, so that it's not just being done as a tick box exercise, and that way the school will benefit the most out of the process as well. So moving on to the responsibilities of the appraisee, all staff, i.e. the appraisees, have to share the responsibility for their own appraisal and take that active role. So the expectation is that you as an individual will be fully engaged with the process of performance management and that you will contribute to it. So you don't just sit there and wait to be told what your objectives are and then turn up for the sort of review meeting at 6 months and 12 months to be able to sort of be told how you performed against those objectives. You want them to be involved in in the discussion of setting their objectives, how they think they can achieve those objectives. So having those discussions about actually what evidence would help me show that I've achieved that objective, that they will actively participate in any agreed monitoring arrangements. And that's part of the discussion when you're setting the objectives. How are we going to monitor your progress against these? What's the best way of you to demonstrate for you to demonstrate that you're meeting those objectives and that you're progressing with them? And you want them to also be thinking about actually what professional learning would benefit me in order to achieve those objectives, and generally just continue to develop and improve in my role. So having them as part of that open discussion and using that coaching technique that we've already discussed is really important, because by using a coaching technique, it's at that point that you're encouraging them to come up with the ideas rather than actually telling them what needs to be done. So that's a really important part, I would say, of where you would use coaching, is that discussion around what do they think they could do as far as objectives are concerned. What do they think they could be? What do they think they need from a professional learning perspective, and how do they think they can demonstrate that they've achieved the objectives at the end of it? So what evidence would they be expected to be gathering in order to show you that they've achieved those objectives? And then at the end of that, then as well, part of their responsibilities is at the end of the cycle that they then provide you with feedback as well on how they think they've performed against those objectives, and their overall performance as well. So it's that two-way discussion, but ideally you want them probably to be doing a little bit more talking than yourself in these discussions. Before I move on to setting objectives, are there any further questions at all? I could just shout if you have, because I can't see any hands up, sorry. No. Okay, so we're just going to move on now to the setting of objectives. Clearly, this is a key part of the performance management process, because actually, what are you actually monitoring if you haven't set clear objectives? So this is, the first really important stage of that performance management process. As I said before, we've got a regional policy which has been commended to all schools across the region, and that policy has been agreed by each local authority following consultation with all of the recognised unions. And the policy states that it's very much focused on teachers because of the appraisal regulations, and that states that teachers should have no more than 3 objectives each performance management cycle, and that's just making sure that it's a manageable amount that you're working towards. The objectives themselves need to focus on what the priorities are for the individual for that particular cycle. They need to be contributing to improving the progress and well-being of learners at the school. You need to be using that statement of objectives to record those, so everybody's got a very clear record of what's been agreed for those objectives. The Objectives themselves should take account of relevant evidence, so including maybe any sort of performance information or information within your school development plan. So again, it's that golden thread that goes, okay, this is what our objective is, and this is how it links to the overall school development plan. And you want them to be focused on the key expectations and developmental priorities on which you can make those evidence-based judgments. So it's really important that when you're setting an objective, you have that conversation around how are we going to measure this? How are we going to know that it's achieved? And this next slide really helps you sort of discuss actually, you know, the key elements so that we know this is a good objective for us to be working to. So it complements the SMART objectives that we often discuss, but it's about having that discussion about, okay, what are we trying to achieve? So what impact are we looking for by setting this objective? How are we going to measure it? So what is my success criteria? Having a discussion with the individual about what they're going to do to get there. So what actions will they be taking in order to achieve that objective? And how you're going to assess if progress is being made. So what monitoring are we going to put in place and how are we going to evaluate that progress? And what you want is those objectives to be challenging but achievable. And you need it to be aligned to the needs of the school and the individual so that they contribute to raising that sort of progress for learners. So when you're writing those objectives, it's about making sure that they're really clear and there's absolute clarity on what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to measure it, what that individual is going to do to actually achieve that objective, how they're going to get there. So breaking that down into components, maybe, you know, what are those actions that you need to take and who maybe that they need to work with in order to be able to achieve that objective, and whether there's any professional learning. So that element there with that action also will be, well, what professional learning do I need to undertake to maybe support me in being able to achieve that? What resources are available to me in order to be able to achieve that objective? And it's about then also that monitoring and evaluation and how those actions and success criteria contribute to the actions and success criteria within the school development plan. When you are setting objectives, there might be circumstances throughout the year that mean that it's no longer possible for those objectives to be achieved. You know, things can change. It might be that that individual no longer is focused on a particular group of pupils that they were to begin with. So if things change throughout the year that mean that it's not possible for an individual to achieve those objectives, or actually the focus might have changed for that individual, then there's absolutely nothing saying that when you've set those objectives at the start of the year, they're set in stone for 12 months. So that's why, again, it's really important to continue to have those discussions on a regular basis throughout the year so that you can identify the circumstances where changes have happened which make those objectives no longer relevant. And then you can talk about how those objectives can be amended in order to make them relevant, or new objectives even wrote in some circumstances. And I think, you know, one of the things that's really highlighted that is the upheaval over those last 2 years with COVID, where whatever objectives that were set in September 2019 were certainly no longer achievable by the time you got to spring term in 2020, because the whole focus and life of school changed dramatically. Hopefully we're never going to be in a position where it's going to be that dramatic again, but circumstances do change and things come up that we're going to be outside the control of the individual maybe, which might require you to have discussions around whether or not objectives are still relevant. So please don't ever think that once you've set them in September, that's it, and you can't rediscuss them throughout that year. You know, it's reasonable to have that discussion if things have changed and revise that in agreement with the individual over that 12-month period if needed. Okay, so we're going to go back into a quick 10-15 minute discussion now. I'll pop you back into the groups that you were in earlier. And what I'd like you to do is in your group, have a discussion around the key priorities from your school development plans or your service area development plan, and have a think about an example teacher performance management objective that would maybe relate to these. So have a discussion about them, pick one maybe particular focus area, and as a group come up with an example teacher performance management objective related to that, and consider what success criteria and monitoring then you would use to evaluate that. I'm not going to ask you to feedback on what those were, but it's just an opportunity for you as a group to have a discussion around how an objective might look, what would be an appropriate objective related to a specific area, and what success criteria and monitoring you might use to evaluate whether or not there's been success with that. We've got 20 minutes left, so I've just got a few more slides to cover in that time. Obviously, once when you've discussed those objectives, well, part of that was discussing what the monitoring of performance would look like as well. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about monitoring performance. So the arrangements for monitoring performance against objectives, including the use of observations, which I'm going to touch on with our next slide, should be discussed and agreed during that planning meeting, and you should be recording that down with those objectives as well. So it's really important that the individual understands and that you agree with that individual actually what's the best way of us monitoring this, what can they expect as far as monitoring procedures are to be used during that 12-month period, and making sure that you discuss a variety of methods, so it's not just focused around just one element, say like the teaching observations, that you're looking at a variety of different methods in order to be able to really accurately monitor whether somebody's making good progress against those objectives or whether a little bit more support needs to be put in place. So at the planning meeting, any sort of supportive action should also be discussed, and any professional learning maybe as well. And what you want is that individual then to be keeping an up-to-date record of what professional learning they're taking, they're undertaking throughout that period as well, so that they can really be able to come to you as well with evidence of what they've done. So, as I said, progress should be monitored via a variety of methods throughout the year, and that can include the use of informal discussion as well as more formal arrangements agreed. So you could be maybe gathering evidence through those in-year meetings between yourself and the individual, that record of professional learning that the individual's been undertaking, progress with the areas that they're focused on, maybe in the school development plan, if they've got that sort of level of responsibility. You might be looking at school performance data and information, pupil progress information, schools' ongoing self-evaluation processes. You might use teaching observations, work scrutiny, planning, so all sorts of those elements, and making sure that you actually use a variety of them will just give you that better picture. Because it's really important that you gather sufficient evidence to enable you to sort of make those secure judgments at the end of that process, and it should be done in that collaborative approach between the individual and their appraiser as well. You'll see on the slide there's reference to a practice review and development record, so this is something that's referred to in the Welsh Government guidance for teacher performance management. So what they're stating is that, and there is a template for it within the performance management policy, and that's just a record where the individual, like I said, it is focused around the teacher performance management, can keep an up-to-date record of their own assessment of performance against the objectives. They can detail any professional learning activities they've undertaken or any other kind of support that they might have received and how that's contributed to their achievement of their objectives. It can detail any factors which they might feel are affecting their performance against the objectives, and what that document does is just provide a focus for the discussions. So it doesn't form part of the appraisal statement itself at the end of it, but it just gives that sort of overarching sort of record for the individual to be able to sort of have that discussion and share information with their appraiser should they wish to. So
Rhiannon, should you be sharing a slide? I can't see a slide on the screen, but I don't know if it's just me.
Oh, or... I should be sharing. Thank you for the prompting.
Not just me.
It wasn't. Thank you. I'd forgotten to press share, so hopefully you can all see them now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I stopped sharing when you all went off into your groups. So this is the slide that I've just talked you through in terms of the where I referenced the practice review and development record. I'm just going to move on now to teaching observations. So classroom observations, as we talked about earlier, they're just one method of monitoring performance. So they should be used in conjunction with other agreed monitoring activities. And the idea really of using teaching observations as part of performance management is that they should be developmental and they should be supportive. So there's an appendix in the performance management policy that's been recommended to schools, which specifically refers to the guidelines issued by Welsh Government on classroom observations. As I talked about earlier, there should be, as part of the performance management processes, no more than 3 observations per year. And they do give a total time not exceeding 3 hours. But I think in reality, it's unlikely that you're going to be doing a full 1 hour observation on 3 occasions throughout the year. For the purpose of performance management, where you're going to be making judgments about as part of the observations, they can only be carried out by a person holding qualified teacher status, and prior to that observation taking place, the nature, purpose and focus of the observation should be agreed with the individual in advance. So the likelihood is you'll have that as discussions around in the planning sort of meeting where you set the objectives and you talk about what monitoring that's going to be taking place. So in advance of the observation, it's just about ensuring that that individual knows what the purpose of it is, what the focus of the observation is in advance, and how that relates to their objectives. And they should just be taking place during lessons and activities that have already, there's the expectation they will already have been planned in advance. So there's not a specific special lesson just for the purpose of the performance management process. So the outcome of the observation, then including any feedback, needs to be recorded in writing, and the teacher should also be given the opportunity to add comments if they wish. If procedures can't be jointly agreed by ultimately the appraiser has the final decision, and they will set and record in writing the procedures to be used for that classroom observation. But obviously what you hope is that you're going to get the opportunity to have a proper discussion with the individual. You can, there's clarity on what's expected, what you're going to be looking for, and the opportunity for the individual to note down any of their comments as well. And hopefully that will get to a point where it's undertaken without any resistance, really. There is an agreed template in the performance management policy as well for use for recording teaching observations. So unless you've got something otherwise agreed with the individual, then this is the template that should be used. So that's just something that we have had discussions with unions on, and they're very clear that the expectation would be that the template is used from the performance management policy. However, clearly, if the individual is in agreement with you using a different template that's used within school, then there shouldn't be an issue. The only issue would be if there is disagreement over a different template, then I would default to the template that's in the performance management policy. With regards to the review, then the expectation is that you have the annual review at the end of the 12-month period, but also that there's a mid-year appraisal review as well, as formal opportunities to recognise achievements and celebrate success, and have that discussion as well around areas for improvement and further professional development. But as I discussed earlier, these are the formal opportunities, but it's good practice as well to have the informal discussions throughout the year as well. The annual review's got to be held with the objective of assessing the extent to which the individuals met their objectives for the cycle, determining whether there's been successful overall performance, and in the case of teachers and teaching assistants, confirming whether or not they continue to meet the professional standards, and identifying the need for any additional support, training and development. So all of those things should take into account any information that the individual provides you as well as part of those discussions. If you can have a situation where performance concerns have arisen throughout that 12-month period, what you shouldn't be doing is holding on to those concerns until this appraisal review meeting to have a discussion. So any kind of concerns need to be raised promptly when they come to light, rather than waiting until a formal review discussion. And I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail, but it's just to highlight, you know, not to hold on to those concerns until your 6 or 12-month review. The review meeting itself is a statutory meeting, so it needs to take place on an annual basis. The date it's held is usually determined by the appraiser. However, there's a requirement for you to give at least 10 school days notice of the meeting in order to allow for the individual to have enough time to prepare for that meeting themselves as well. And so the teacher, the expectation within the policy is as well that the teacher submits any sort of information as far as their PRD record at least 5 days prior to the meeting as well. So there is a sort of a structure of notice. The likelihood is you'll be having those discussions with the individual in the lead up anyway, and you'll agree a mutually convenient date for those discussions. As part of the performance review, obviously there's a requirement on you as appraisers of what your role is and what preparation you need to take. But clearly, if it's going to be a two-way process, in order for it to be a valuable and effective process, then the individual also needs to have reflected in advance of that meeting on the work that they've undertaken over the year, their strengths, their achievements, and any area of development. So you're expecting that individual to come in having reflected on their own assessment of performance against the objectives, having considered what evidence they've got of their performance in the cycle and how they've achieved the objectives that were set. Having considered the benefits they've had from any professional learning that they've undertaken, and maybe being able to demonstrate to you how they've put that in practice. Having thought about any in-year reviews that have taken place and any specific feedback that they've received, and maybe how they've put that feedback into practice and move forward with it. Having considered any factors that maybe have affected their performance, what impact that's had, maybe what they've done to try and overcome those factors. And also you want them to have been thinking about any possible objectives for the next cycle. And if they've been involved as part of the school development of the school development plan, then, you know, hopefully they will have been in a better position to also not only consider objectives for the next cycle from a professional learning and personal point of view, but how that will impact and contribute to the school development plan as well. So finally, once you've undertaken the review meeting and you've discussed all of the information, then as part of the process, specifically for teachers, there is that requirement that within 10 days of that review meeting, that you as an appraiser provide the teacher with a written statement recording the main points of discussion between yourself and the individual and the conclusions that you reach. So again, there's a template for that as part of the performance management policy, and you would normally have given a little bit of an overview of whether you think that the objective has been met, partially met, not met, and just some bullet points around why you've come to that conclusion. None of it should be a surprise to the individual when they get the statement, because it should all be based around the discussion that you've had at that review meeting itself. That's provided to the teacher within 10 days, 10 school days of the appraisal review meeting. And what you should then be seeking is to agree the wording of the final statement within 10 days then of them receiving it. So the teacher has a further 10 school days to add any comments to the statement, and those comments then form part of the final statement. So effectively you should have within a 20 working day period an appraisal statement that is the final version, and that is a personal and confidential document, and that needs to be kept within a secure place within school and only available to the appraiser, the teacher and the head teacher. So they would be the only parties who would be entitled to access that appraisal statement. The only circumstances where maybe some governors are entitled to see that is where they're making any decisions in relation to pay. So that would only really be relevant for those going from main pay scale to upper pay spine, because then they're obviously required to submit their last 2 years worth of appraisal statements as part of that application. So that is something that they would therefore have the opportunity to be able to see as governors on the pay review panel, making the decision as to whether or not to accept the recommendation that that person does or doesn't progress. So all of that is a statutory requirement for teachers. So I'm just going to touch now, final 2 slides are around sort of if you have any, what to do when you have any performance concerns, and also what happens with absence. So firstly, to touch on performance concerns, where you've got any performance concerns around an individual, then as I said earlier, it's important that you raise that with them as soon as possible and explore support that can be provided to help them. So as the appraiser, you're going to be the person having those most regular conversations with the individual. So the likelihood is you're going to be the person who is going to pick up on performance concerns before maybe other senior leaders will within the school. And I recognise it's not an easy conversation to have, but it is really essential that it's held promptly to avoid situations getting worse. And the likelihood is there'll be small conversations to begin with. I do deliver professional learning around challenging conversations. So if you did want to sort of upskill a little bit in that area, then you're welcome to obviously attend that, and that's bookable via the professional learning calendar. But what I would say is there's no expectation, if you've got some serious concerns around somebody's performance, that as an appraiser you manage that on your own. So make sure you inform your head teacher or your service lead if you're working for one of the local authority education services, because you shouldn't, there's no expectation for you to manage that performance concern alone. If you're a head teacher, then I would suggest that you make sure that your appraisers are aware of the need to advise you as soon as possible if they begin to become concerned about somebody's performance. And where those concerns continue and start to feel much bigger, despite maybe any additional support provided, then that is where, you know, as a head teacher, that they might start considering whether or not the capability procedure would be the most appropriate process to start looking at. In any of those circumstances, my recommendation would be before you take any action, you contact your local authority HR to get some support, advice and guidance. So where you've got serious concerns about somebody's performance, even if even where you're a head teacher, as a head, contact your HR support, and they should be able to give you some guidance on what to do in those circumstances. And finally then is absence, and I think questions around absence came up a lot more when I think we had that direct link between the performance management outcomes and pay progression. However, you still need to consider the impact of absence on somebody's ability to be able to achieve objectives that you might have set for somebody. So the 2 types of absence that tend to have that tend to impact are long-term sickness absences and maternity leave, because they're sort of where staff are going to be away from for a bigger chunk of time, so can have an impact on somebody's ability to achieve their objective. Obviously, maternity leave, that's an absence that can be planned for, so you can amend objectives where you need to, maybe in advance of somebody's maternity leave, so that you can take into account the fact that that individual maybe is going off on maternity leave, say, I don't know, in the April, so whatever objectives you set in the September or October, if you already know that person's going to be going off then, that you take into account the length of time that individual has got in school to be able to achieve the objectives for that year. If it comes up partway through the year, then by all means, go and have a conversation about, okay, let's have a little look at those objectives and decide whether we need to amend them to take into account the amount of time you have to achieve them, because it's about being realistic. With sickness absence, it's similar in principle, but obviously most of the time sickness absence can't be planned for. So there will need to be a review taken place on return for that individual, just to look at what objectives were taken. Is it possible still to achieve those objectives in the time that they've got left from that year, and what amendments need to be made to it. So it's just about that open discussion really, and making sure that is an ongoing dialogue when they're in work. Okay, so just unless there's any other questions, if I could just ask you, again, same principle as you did with the attendance, if you could either click on the link there at the bottom of the screen, use your camera on your phone to use the QR code, or I'll put this link into the chat now shortly, just to fill in the end of session evaluation. So the success criteria that you'll be asked about, you can see on the slide. So I'll leave this slide up for you to have a little look at. Again, course code and course title is on there, and that will just record your completion of the session and provide with any sort of evaluation feedback that you want to provide. But other than that, just leaves me to say diolch yn fawr, thank you very much for attending this afternoon, and hopefully you found it a useful session. Thanks.